the human experience, the human race, eliminate disease. Well, is that possible? Are we going to really improve the gene pool? And will we alter the concept of human heredity? Will there be any temptation to kind of a form of selective breeding? Now, this has been done before. I mean, in our own country in the 30s and 40s, the Kellogg family were at the forefront of genetics, and not genetics, of eugenics. And they were the ones that wanted to make sure we kind of sorted out those elements of our society that could contaminate the human experience. And of course, everything about Germany in World War II was about purifying the race. That was the essence of Nazism. So I'm going to ask you to think about this from the perspective, are we really clear about where this is going, where this whole kind of research, where our concerns are focused in this? Remember, medicine is a big business, especially offshore. It's controlled somewhat in the US, but in other places around the world, it's very rarely controlled. And there is a persistent view that's growing, especially offshore, that it is genes that makes us what we are. Now, we've said that we're children of God. We say we're a part of God's creation. We affirm that. But suddenly, science has taken us by the throat, really, hasn't it? In the last year, science becomes everything. Every newscaster refers to science. We're not sure what they're talking about sometimes, but science is always the promise. So how in the world can we avoid hereditary illness? That's the question. Now, let me give you a little bit of background on how this unfolded. In 53, the team came up with the helix, the double helix. By the time we get to the 59, we already get to the discovery of a Down syndrome gene, already by 59. By 69, we've discovered how sugar metabolism takes place through genetic force and effort and shaping. And then by the time we get to 1986, we've already gotten to hepatitis B. And from there on, we get to discovery susceptibility to breast cancer. And we get into the issues of the forces that shape cancer of the uterus. And before long, we're into a kind of view in which we are producing products as a result of genetic research. And 1997, Dolly, remember Dolly? So, we move quickly through this. It's a long time, of course, but it's our lifetime. It's 50 plus years. And suddenly we see we've moved from a discovery to the kind of movement that shapes all kinds of treatments for a lot of diseases, including cystic fibrosis, prostate cancer, sometimes even focused on obsessive and violent behavior, aging and obesity, and even the question of more happiness, genes that will produce those. Now, that may be our world. That may be the world we're going to be living in the next several years. So my question to you is, are we facing the whole debate again? What comes first, nature or nurture? What is a human being really like? what is this new technology doing? Has it destroyed the balance? Is it now producing a kind of a expectation level about illness? And molecular biology now has become a much more significant force. And the dividing line between biology and culture is now kind of blurred. And the question of human autonomy and free will are questions now that have a certain legitimacy that maybe we haven't thought about. Do we have a free choice? Or we are what we are? Are we the product of our genes? What do you think? Any comments?
Have you heard about CRISPR? The ability to change the genetic structure within human beings. That's how the COVID vaccines are. They are actually changing RNA structure with the vaccine. And
that
eventually the idea is that you could change genetic structure of human beings not in the next generation, but in this generation for you and I. And that's a radical new, who knows how far along we are in that.
Right. The problem is we've lived with for a year under this burden of concern about a serious illness. So people, there are scientists even now who worry about this whole idea of creating vaccines and the issue of vaccines. Now, I've had my shot, so I'm not speaking against them, but there are some that argue, do we know what the long-term result of it will be? Do we have any sense of that? I mean, do we really know what a genetic disease is? In this period that followed all of the activities of the last 20 or 30 years, we have not accepted acute disease as a part of life. We've railed against that. We think we can cure everything, don't we? Or we believe we should. And every physician I know, and I've known many, many who have made this whole genetic search central to their work, especially in my hospice work, many of these people have thought genetics would be the answer, solution. And so changing expectations in the general population is a fact of life.
Well,
now, yes.
I was just going to say, I think that, we've created these expectations, and I mean, one place you can really see it clearly is in prenatal decisions, right? Yes. A couple in the church I served up in Seattle were told through an amniocentesis that their child had a birth defect, genetic birth defect,
right,
and that it would be fairly severe. And all of a sudden, the parents needed to make a choice whether to have that child delivered or whether to abort that child. And given the quality of life, kind of like we talked about last week, this tension between sanctity and the quality of life. What would the quality of life of this child and eventually maybe an adult be? And what would the quality of the life of the family be, given that they're going to need to take care of this child? And those are tough decisions. And in the case of this family that were friends of mine and at the church, they decided to have the child. And I think they're happy they did. But I think, those are decisions that are being made every day.
Well, Wes, I'm going to talk a little bit about that because when we get to the idea of cloning, one of the reasons cloning has received such popularity is because there has been this kind of floated idea that maybe we can clone children, especially if you've lost a child. If you've lost a child, all it takes is a strand of hair, the genetic structure very easy to get the genetic structure. Can you replicate that child? Now, is that an ethical idea? Is that a thought that we want to nurture to replace a child? Or even worse, an uglier thought is that if we have a child that's very ill and they need certain body parts, we can use some process to create a source for those body parts. That's an area I don't even want to get into because it seems so abhorrent to me. But nevertheless, that is the kind of material you see when you do the research in this topic. So I guess the basic question that I'd be very interested in hearing your response to is, what does it mean to be human? How do you understand your humanness, your humanity? I mean, is it part of the mystery of existence? Can we rely upon a source that gives us a diagnostic approach, a treatment, a prevention of disease? And do we have a right to health? Do human beings have a human right for health? Any thoughts? Let me give you a chance to jump in there if you want to. Too many hard questions?
Alice, were you going to say something?
Well, there's all kinds of things running through my mind. The nature versus nurture has been discussed so long for most of my lifetime, which is a long time. And, you know, it seems like that's pretty well determined. It's both. You can't, you know, it's not so simple to say it's just one or the other. We're a combination of all those things. I think what happens so frequently with these, let's just say cloning, I'll just use that term for all of this bioengineering and whatnot. The science of it goes so fast, and the politics of it, or the social part of it, is so slow. So we get caught up in the struggle. Anyway, that's just a few thoughts. Cloning children, I say out. No.
Yes.
Yes. I've been thinking about the whole genetic engineering for a few days, and one of the thoughts I had, I kind of thought about it the way I thought about Facebook. That when Mark Zuckerberg first came up with Facebook, it just seemed like magic, and what a wonderful idea it was, and all the wonderful things it could do. But they failed to look at the downside. Yes. They really did. And yes. with this kind of thing, yes. It sounds wonderful to be able to get rid of diseases and all this kind of stuff. But there's a definite downside there, a very, very scary downside. And human beings are pretty good at abusing such things. And the idea of it frightens me. It really frightens me.
Thank you. It's a great observation. Really, yeah. The problem is we like to use the word normal. I'm not sure what the word normal really means. Do you know what normal means? It's a very vague term. Philosophically, it's a very vague term, normal. So those that want to support, let me give you the argument on the behalf of those in the medical profession who want to support genetic research. They will say, well, this is not like the old eugenics. No. This is not social policy. This is not in seeking the improvement of the species, nor is it an attempt to transform the collective gene pool. Rather, it's a methodical way of looking at disease. Now, you see the danger in that. That all sounds reasonable. It sounds decent. It sounds acceptable to us. The problem is that genetic research is only started, really. Most of the people in this field think that we're 50 years away still from really fulfilling the destiny of this new discipline. And it has to do with abnormal births, as Wes talked about. It has to do with, are we making choices in behalf of the next generation? See, that's the question there. And most of all, and this is just the way life unfolds, just think of the money we're going to save in our medical system. The burden of medical care will be, I mean, we've seen the burden of a disease placed upon our hospitals, the stress that's placed in the hospital system. But suppose we get to a point where genetic kind of treatment, you know, the use of viruses and splicing and all of that, that could solve a lot of major diseases. Then we all could live forever, you see, or almost forever, or we think we could at least. So you see, the whole process gets very, very muddled because there are voices that are raised that say, you know, we need to pursue this. It is just inevitable that we do. And to raise the issue of normality against the concept of abnormality is an issue that we have to talk about. You know, I mean, that's just the way it is. And are we willing
I think
to
Steve
live?
has,
Yes.
I think Steve has a comment. And
All
Well,
right, good.
I'd like to actually address the question that you raised, Emil, about whether humans have a right to health.
Yes.
I can't answer that question, but I believe humans have a right to seek health,
Oh, yes.
and other humans have a right to provide health for other people.
Yeah. Mhm.
And so if we have a right to seek health, then it would be hard to limit how we seek health unless you wish to deny that right.
That's true. That's true. You're not going to be able to put limit. No one's going to be able to put limits on this. If you know there's something out there that will cure or fix or restore somebody you love, that's all that matters.
It's also a matter of seeking through scientific means to try to develop a means to restore health or provide health for somebody who wouldn't have that opportunity otherwise.
That's true. And that's part of the whole matter of the medical system. Yes.
Right.
Here is where we're seduced by all of this, though. Suppose in the treatment of genetic disease, we find a way to deal with mental illness. Suppose that happens. And there's research being done there. We're finding disease-causing genes that truly restore people from that kind of illness. I mean, we would all rejoice in that, wouldn't we? That would be a moment of exhilaration. So you see, folks, this is a complicated, we're into, like, as someone said, for every wondrous aspect to life, there's always some dark side. There's always something that raises questions. And in this particular area, you know, we're facing serious issues that are a long way from being resolved. You know, this is not science fiction. This is reality. And it has to do with our heredity. So when we start thinking about cleansing the gene pool, that's a problem. Sterilization has been done over the centuries. It has been done in the last century. You sterilize so people do not reproduce their illness. Linus Pauling said once that he thought everybody who has sickle cell anemia should have it tattooed on their forehead, because he said if they marry another person, that's a terribly evil and destructive thing with the same disease. So that raises some interesting questions, especially now, over the years, people before they got married had to take blood tests, right? I don't know if that's ever been done in California. Russ, has that been done away with in California?
I think it has been, yeah.
But you see, the idea behind that is some way to find out. I'm not sure that was really done carefully, to find out the nature of the illnesses that might be present in the marriage relationship. So there's that element, of course. And then, of course, human beings being what they are, you know, this is a very human response. Just think if you could create a designer child. I mean, imagine you could have an Einstein or a Mozart or a Michael Jordan, who knows? You could, yeah. My wife's got a comment. Go ahead.
We're all unique people. Okay, we all have our own, there's nobody else like us. I was just thinking of what we've done to hybridize, say, strawberries and tomatoes.
Yeah, all right.
We fought with a perfect fruit, and they're absolutely gorgeous and they're tasteless. So we've gone back to the heirloom things. Now, if we do that with people and try to produce the perfect person, would that make everybody alike?
So, Cosette, a voice in the distance. Did you hear it, what she said?
No, can you synthesize it for us?
She said, just think of what's take place in the vegetable area. We've done everything to treat vegetables, to perfect them, to make them so saleable, so that they're so desirable. I mean, we've found ways to eliminate certain problems in the vegetables, and so science does that. It moves always towards some view of perfection, right? There's their view of perfection, and because then I observed, but today people are going back to the old vegetables, heirloom tomatoes, for example, that there's been a return, a bounce back from that. But the fact is, we use these kind of techniques in so many areas of life we don't even know about. The idea of producing a product that is genetically superior, you see?
I think there was some questions, Emil. I think
Yes.
Rula and David maybe wanted to say something.
Yes, please. I'm
Rula first.
Well, I'm asking for clarification. You kind of brushed over the COVID vaccine, it being genetically modified, or it modifies your genetics. And for example, in my country, people are refusing to take the vaccine because
Yes.
they're afraid.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious to hear from you. Why do you think it's different? Like, why do you think it's a good thing, and why should people not be afraid of it while we're ruling out other similar methods?
Let me go back a little. Let's take a step backward. First of all, the research that's being done on vaccines in terms of genetics worries about this a lot. It worries about not only the production of these kind of products, but whether or not they can, we have long-term test validation. That's number one. So they have a right to be concerned. I'm going to affirm their concern. The problem in life is sometimes our choices are very narrow. And right now, the choice we have in America, at least, and maybe in other countries, can we do something to forestall, to limit the dangers that exist in our present social intercourse? Can we do something? And so if Johnson & Johnson produces a vaccine that is 95% effective, finally 96% effective, and they promise us that it's been tested, it's a risk. Yes, I think it is a risk. but it's a risk that we think is worth taking simply because we are members of a community and we want to save the lives of other people. We don't want to be a source of disease. So that's a choice we make. But your point is valid, and that is, I've talked to several people, even recently, who are not going to take the vaccine. In fact, I passed a house recently that said, we stay in the house, we don't go out, we don't need a vaccine. A little sign in front. So I think there is this tension that exists. And that's true of a lot of things in life. Sometimes we act out of our responsibility to the community. Sometimes that's a very dangerous course to take, yes. And so I think this is a personal decision, and it demands some degree of introspection, I think, really, because I guess you will hear from about this next week, but we do have a responsibility in some ways to the whole system, to that which supports all of our medical care, the hospital system, that we're taxpayers after all. So there is that element that we bear some responsibility for. And remember, there are a lot of things that are mistakes were made over history. In 1984, to improve the gene pool in Singapore, women of low intelligence were not allowed to have more children. All right. Or in China in 1988, banning marriage of mentally retarded people unless sterilized. So this is not in the distant past. Countries today, many countries, and probably more than we know, want to produce a more genetic, homogeneous, and a more reliable gene pool. Of course they do. The only thing I would say about America, and this is not for the world, but thanks for your question, because we have to go offshore. Most of the really questions that raise these issues that are beyond us in a lot of ways is that we live in a political democracy. We have American Acts of Disability, we have AARP, of course, we have women's movements, we have social power groups, we have ombudsman for healthcare. We have some safety net, not a lot, but some. But some places in the world, for example, we talk about cloning. China has already indicated they cloned a pair of twins. Now, most of the scientific community doubts it, but they've claimed it. So, in a sense, we live in a world where there's potential for great exploitation. And listen, folks, where there is, and we know this from our lives, where there is consumer demand, legal risk falls by the wayside. Government control is minimized. Even religious ideology becomes less important. Social visibility even diminishes. So you see, there's a balancing act here for all of us, but when there's a demand for something, that's very real, that's very persistent. So see, the question for Christians, let's put it into our own context now for our own personal journey. How shall we care for one another in the future? How do we, as Christians, look at the world and ask the question, what is my responsibility for other people in the future as my life unfolds in the future? On what basis do I make decisions? How do those decisions bind us together? How do they set boundaries for our tolerance? How do they help us intervene in the lives of others in positive ways? How do they help us inspire public policy? You see, all of those are important questions. Too many questions, perhaps. So in a sense, are we called upon to be our brother's keeper, really, in some ways? So I'm going to suggest to you that the tension that exists is the one that is between a vision that seeks to ensure rights, freedoms, liberties, and opportunities, and help, assistance, and support for people through social interventions. That's one way. The other vision, the human condition is improved, not by new laws or by social institutions, but by genetic and reproductive interventions. That is the tension between what we are doing in terms of our social commitment today, which we are responsible for in the world, to help shape the society, or perhaps to understand the opposite point of view, and that the way in which we make societies better is through genetic and reproductive interventions and science, scientific development. Now that's a dichotomy that exists. You know, here's the real problems now. I mean, I've offered you some of the technical or philosophical or theoretical ideas. What will the insurance companies do? Will they insure us? I mean, if they find out we have an illness, if we're being treated for an illness or for a genetic illness, how will we be protected? Should our children be tested? What about the workplace? Does your boss want to know, your employer want to know that you have a serious genetic illness? I mean, I'm talking about the discovery of genetic illnesses now. Has the gening of America really made us vulnerable?
Uh-oh.
He's gone again.
Yeah, both Cosette and Emil have frozen. It looks like he mentioned to me, maybe before some of the rest of you got on, that the Wi-Fi went out last week and he needs to replace his router because it looks like something like that has happened again. Well, I think, David, you had a question that we didn't hear or thought.
Yeah, more of a comment. It just sounded to me like we're talking about the evolution of the human species, whether we stop here and kind of resist the options, or whether we embrace the fact that we are still evolving as a species. And our genetic knowledge and our scientific knowledge is part of that evolution. And we're all contributing to it, as it were. But I don't think we can resist it. I don't think we can turn it back. I don't think we can unevolve. Well, I guess we can devolve, but our desire is to evolve as a species. And that's the business of being human, and also the business of Westminster, to inform and to enlighten and uplift the process and be part of the process rather than an observer. You know. There was one other point, though. We talked about Francis Crick and his discovery of the double helix DNA molecule and how amazingly important that has been in the development of genetics. I'm not sure how widely known it is, but Francis Crick supposedly envisioned the DNA molecule during an LSD experience, and that from that point he developed the theory. And you know, I didn't talk to him about it, so I'm not sure, but I think it's at least a consideration. Consideration. All right, those are my comments.
Go ahead, Jill.
So Wes, I think you brought up a more realistic area of discussion, and that is whether a woman should abort her fetus when she's told that it is there are serious complications if she carries the pregnancy on. I also think at the other end of life, with what we were talking about last week, it's the same question of when do we let people die? Now, Emil talked, apparently he was involved in the Karen Ann Quinlan case when he opened this series. I looked her up, and she did live another 10 years after they removed the ventilator, but the medical community, the doctors who examined her, said that she was in a persistent vegetative state, which means most of her brain was dead except the autonomic part that kept her breathing. And part of why it might have even been working is that they had her on a ventilator, and for a while. Then they take her off the ventilator, and so she, that part of her brain was able to keep her alive. But and then when she did finally clinically die, an autopsy was done, and yes, all of her brain was dead except that very base part, which was the persistent vegetative state that the doctors said she was in 10 years earlier. So I think these are more realistic discussions for us to delve into. Emil did ask the question, at what point are we human? And at what point are we no longer human, even though our bodies are still alive? And I think that should be what we're talking about, myself. Some of these other things are too, they're too esoteric or unrelated to our quest for moral judgments.
I think Elizabeth has something. Yeah, thanks,
Okay,
Jill.
I'm back with you.
Yes.
Oh, good.
I'd like to speak to the fact that we live on one planet and we have not figured out how to live anywhere else. And we have finite resources, and that needs to have some bearing on this. If you could keep all
Good
disease
point.
and everybody could live to be 120 years old, we're going to run out of food.
200.
Interesting point. Very good. Thanks.
It's a really good point. I'm sorry.
Good.
I actually had this argument with a friend the other day who thinks that, just imagine if science can manage to keep people alive for over 100 years and like how much wisdom we can have, or like if someone is really smart. And I'm like, no, I have ethical problems with that. I think that the way God created this world to go into seasons and people die and people are born, and there is wisdom in it, and I don't think we should interfere in it. And I didn't think about like running out of resources, which is a practical reason why this should not happen. But also like, it's like, what are we taking away from the future generations if we do that?
Yeah, they don't want us around forever, that's true.
Right.
Okay, go ahead.
Now?
Yeah. Steve, go ahead.
It sounds like we're getting into the realm of euthanasia,
Yeah, I'm sure.
limiting
that-
how long people can live. in
Mhm.
order to save the resources that we imagine cannot be expanded.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
Well,
I don't think I
Let me-
want to go there.
let me tell you though, we may not talk about this often, but on bioethics committees that I've been on, they talk about this all the time. Because
Bad.
hospitals have limited resources and they have to deal with those limited resources. So they're always concerned about, length of life, length of stay, seriousness of illness, the destructiveness of the illness. Those are all key questions that are just part of that, the normal discussion. And they're part of our lives. And we all think about that. We have to, because, we're all in a sense preparing for the end of our lives. That's our preparation. That's what.
Bodies aren't made to last over 100 years.
No, that's right. So in a sense, that's part of the hard work of us, of many of us at this point of our lives. How do we deal with this? Now, when I present this topic, this really has much more to do with the younger generation who have to make decisions about their future. I mean, if you had would you want to know of a serious illness you had, a genetic illness? Would you want to know it, or would you rather not know? If there's no cure, what would you rather know? I mean, do people need to know? I always worried about this. We don't have crystal balls. We just don't. So, to what extent, if a person has, if you're a member of your family has Huntington's disease, for example, and you're likely to be a candidate for that, do you want to be tested for it? Do you want to know it's going to be coming? And to how much will that shape your life? You see how destructive sometimes knowledge gets in the way of living. So I can't, yes.
This is Don. I have the opposite view. If I knew I had a genetic predisposition for something that's shortening my life, I would make a better effort to make the best of what I have.
So you're one of those that would prefer to know?
Yes, I definitely would want to know.
Yeah, some people wouldn't. A lot of people wouldn't. They would think they would find it, they would say, I mean, it's sometimes hard to get a whole family. If there's Huntington's disease, for example, you want to get the whole family tested. You'd be surprised how that family breaks out in terms of those that want to be tested and those that don't.
Well, but they have, each individual has the right to.
Yes, of course.
To, make their own decision. And some people do want to know and plan their lives accordingly. Others don't want to know. And it's like when a woman is pregnant, she can be told the sex that she's carrying, or she can choose not to be told, even though, her doctor may know. I mean, these are individual choices that people can make. They don't have to.
It's true. I just want to end our session up because we haven't got a lot of time left, but I want to talk a little more about cloning because that's an interesting topic. It's a little theoretical, I understand, but someone, I mentioned, the idea of children. And there's all kinds of cloning. There's been a great report produced by in 2001 by a commission on cloning in America. But here's what this commission suggested: that cloning to produce children, for example, would be extremely unsafe. That most cloning is multiple attempts are necessary. And they identified 5 categories of concern for cloning to produce children. First, they're concerned about cloned children may experience social problems of identity that we just don't know anything about. The danger is there. They really may not be able to mature the way a child of a normal birth. And secondly, cloned children, are not necessarily gifts. They are manufactured. And it creates a kind of commercialization of that process that they believe is, most people believe it really injures the process. Most of us want to think of our children as a gift. They're a gift to us. And then the idea that it fits perfectly into this whole concept of new eugenics, we create children that are have generic traits that we really like. We can create children that may suit us in terms of quality, in terms of appearance, And so that's another problem with, just the idea of cloning children. And then there are natural boundaries, of course, that just get in the way all the time. And that society finally is deeply affected by this because the ties in a family structure are not the same, cannot be the same. So just an interesting point, how far cloning has produced this kind of document in which there is this notion, the assumption is that we will, in our lifetimes, may see cloning as a more real option, especially again offshore. Maybe not so much in our own country, but certainly offshore. That cloning will become, there is a rush, a competition, if you will, scientifically, to clone. That's just true. I mean, in 2003, a little kitten was cloned. Her name was Cece at Texas A&M. A kitten cloned. So you see, how far are we away from children? And do we even want that? Is that a notion that we could tolerate? I doubt it. As Steve said, I don't think we'd be too happy with that. I doubt it. Nevertheless, we as Christians must take a stand and take a position. That's what we do. That's what we're called to do, to assert ourselves in terms of our worldview. You can respond to cloning as just as the idea of cloning.
I think Connie has a comment.
Yes.
I have a comment. Identical twins, I believe, have the same genetic.
Correct.
Yes.
And yet they're not the same people. They're different.
Right.
How
That's
can
true.
one clone somebody's brain and their character and all of that other kind of stuff? You could have somebody who looked exactly like Mary, who was your first child or whatever it was, but it isn't Mary, it's somebody else. And that person is going to respond differently, I would think.
Mm-hmm.
Even though they're genetically identical, they're going to respond differently to their life experiences. It's not going to be, for a sheep, you don't have much personality in a sheep, but people have personalities and character and souls. And
Thank you.
I don't know. I just find the whole idea unacceptable myself.
Honey, you raised the issue though that was raised earlier, the battle between there's still a battle of reality, I suppose, between nature and nurture.
Yeah. Well,
are human beings? Are we the product of our genes, or are we people a product of our social environment, created in our relationships, our spiritual journey, and all the rest of that?
I think
who are we?
Yeah, we're the product of both.
Right. It's
Okay.
a combination.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think Elizabeth has something.
Yeah, Elizabeth.
There we go.
Good.
My understanding about cloning is that when the cells are taken from the donor, if you will, that the clone sort of starts at that age. So if you cloned a 4-year-old sheep, it would live 4 years less than a given lifespan.
That's interesting. I really didn't know that. That's an interesting observation. Thanks for that. I'm not sure. I don't know I have the significant document on cloning, but I don't know that explains that particular differential. That's an interesting point. Where do we begin when we clone? Interesting. Yeah, good point. Thanks.
You know, David made the comment earlier about, well, you know, that we're evolving and medicine and you know, genetics is a part of that. And so, which made me think of the idea that, you know, the genie's out of the bottle. I mean, these are, as we go forward more and more deeply into a utilitarian attitude and away from this idea that God controls things, you know, more of a theological that, you know, that our culture certainly has been immersed in, but we're becoming more and more secularized, and therefore, you know, utilitarianism is going to be bigger and bigger influence.
Yeah.
And I just don't know how you stop this stuff
That's
if
true.
you don't have sort of the break of, well, these are things that are controlled by God and we shouldn't be messing with them, you know, which now sounds very anachronistic, right? We
Sure
don't
does.
Like
think
who
that way,
decides to represent God? I mean, who's your choice?
yeah, there you go. But
the problem.
Oh, go ahead.
Yes. The problem you have, of course, is we're on a slippery slope. The slippery slope is that we are losing control of our ability to stand up for what we call an ethical view, a moral view of the universe. Because if there is free reign in this area, I mean, is it, for example, I don't know if this is true, but this is talked about, that some countries who are militaristic are trying to find ways to genetically produce kinds of human beings who are much more militaristic, much more
Perfect
capable.
soldiers. Yes.
Yeah, perfect, right, of course. Now, that may be far-fetched. That may be a purely hysteria. But nevertheless, if countries are thinking that way, if they think that way, that's enough of an indictment for us to confront it. I mean, do we want to shape the world? I mean, are we going to shape the world in terms of our own self-interest, our own power structure, our own desire for wealth and dominance? Is that how we want to shape the world? And that's a logical, if we get to cloning, that's a logical destination. Maybe not now, but certainly down the road somewhere. So you see, inherently, all of these things can be evil. They can be good and they can be evil, like so many things in life. That mixture is difficult for us. Don't you face it every day? Some things can be both good and evil too. That's the balance we have to deal with in our lives. And so I would have you think about the fact that when people begin to talk about this, you know, down the road, that we find a way to assert at least an opinion or take a position and maybe exert some influence in terms of the idea that perhaps there is a creation. We live in a creation, not in a genetic pool, but a creation. You see, that's a religious idea. Maybe more than ever, the church has a place for the future, right? More than ever. Any other thoughts? Yes.
Yeah. I think that there is a very good call for genetic research. I think back to the polio epidemics that happened. Most of them prior to when I was born in 1947, but I certainly, as a child, saw a lot of people in wheelchairs and whatnot, and knew that they had polio. And then, of course, I was in elementary school when we got the little sugar cubes, and to the best of my knowledge, we've pretty well eliminated polio in our community. I know smallpox. There were some devastating pan epidemics of smallpox in the past, and I think that that's very rare now. So, and the other thing that when I was, 20 or 30 years ago, I was diagnosed with depression, and I was trying, with the help of my doctor, to find the medicine that could treat it. And sometimes you're lucky, but sometimes, it's a very lengthy process. And at that point, I had heard about scientists, probably geneticists, working on seeing if they could develop a blood test that might help diagnose or treat depression.
Yeah.
So
Mhm.
I think that there's no question that we need to continue with genetic research. But you're right, we need to set some ethical limits. And it's very hopeful for you to say that this is a good role for the church. That's a hopeful thing.
Thank you. Yeah, the question, of course, is that we live in a world, as Wes has talked about several times, where the range of our influence is diminishing. And my experience with all these illnesses, many of these illnesses, is to want to cure them, of course. And we want people to get healthy, of course. But as someone said, sometimes the choice between wanting them to get healthy and the kinds of involvement that treatments involve create a real test. Let me just say this about this is an opinion now. You can disagree with this. We live in a scientific world. We think science is important, right? I mean, we've been told that for a year now, how important science says this, science says that. Science is not God. It is not God. I'll argue that point with anybody. It is not. Science is a trial and error judgment process in which we come up to a conclusion that is tentative at best. It's a temporary understanding because it's always changing. So that's a prejudice I have, that we dare not substitute science for the deity. We just can't do that. I find that to be a serious objection. Anybody, you want to respond to that, anybody?
Well,
you can argue.
Science is part of God's creation as well. Human consciousness is part of God's creation and all that goes with it. And I don't think that you can snip off the sharp edges, that it all it's a package.
Well, you
And
believe that.
I'm not afraid of science. Science is like what Alice is talking about. Without science, we'd still have polio. We'd still have horrible diseases, which we found solutions for. And as far as the possibilities, the kind of the science fiction possibilities for genetic manipulation and cloning and so on, you can pose those, but you just can't assume the worst. You can't assume because there's the possibility of destruction that I guess we shouldn't go there. But it just reminds me of Einstein and the H-bomb. How was he to know that his discoveries might be turned towards evil? Well, that's an ethical question, but we all have something to do with the choices of what we do about nuclear war. And we're still working on that as part of our evolution. This is all part of our evolution.
Okay.
I think Steve has something.
All right, Steve.
I view science as a gift of God, as any other intellectual and experimental approach. If God gave us science and gave us inquiring minds minds wanting to explore the world that God has given us, discover how it works and how we can help it work for us.
Amen. Amen.
Yeah,
Okay.
go ahead. Jill has something.
All right, Joe.
I believe science deals with the physical world. It comes to conclusions based on logical thinking. It is never going to prove or disprove that God exists. That's a completely different question than how the physical world operates. So I don't see them as, I see them as different planes of discussion, not contrary and not the same.
Okay.
This
Wes?
is Don. I've got something that is I've come to a realization about an evolution that has occurred in our lifetime. So many years ago, parents go to fertility clinics and they pick the genetics of whoever they want to combine with to create kids, okay? But there's extreme non-disclosure to find out, you know, the genetic makeup, but you don't know who who that person is, or their address, or how to contact them. So there's a lot of secrecy with that aspect. Now the kids now have grown up, but now we've got Ancestry.com. So they go to Ancestry.com and then discover they've got cousins all over the neighborhood. So anyway, it's just kind of an interesting progression, how you make an effort to pick the correct genetic and have the right outcome, and then later on, and all this secrecy, and then later on, the child discovers that they've got cousins and their genetic background doesn't match with the cousins that they grew up with. And so anyway, but it's a good thing in that, if in case they should happen to, what if they happen to meet them in college or something? And so,
well, not only that,
it's just very unusual set of circumstances that we've kind of evolved and developed in the recent.
Sometimes they want to know. They want to know the illnesses of the parents. They want to know if there's any. They will be concerned about any, medical records.
Right.
If they're medical records.
Right.
Because they're interested in knowing, what aspects they've inherited, their heredity. Yeah.
As you talk about this drift into scientism, we all have an appreciation for science. Where does it drift into scientism that science gives our lives meaning? A great story, a great parable, of course, is the story of Frankenstein, where the scientific creation comes back to be the monster. And I think we see that we can see that in various ways as science that we would hope would bring relief from suffering actually creates suffering.
Yes. Yeah, it's true. I think all good things have some downsides. Yes. Nothing. I don't think we've come. Things are always somewhat. There's always limitations involved in everything, I think. Okay. Yes. Anybody?
Yeah, one of the greatest thinkers who recently died was Stephen Hawking. And as a young man, he got ALS, and if science hadn't have kept him alive, we wouldn't have had all of the brilliance of his mind on the universe. right? I mean, we all know Stephen Hawking.
Right. His contributions
Yeah, his
would
contribution.
have been lost.
Yeah.
Jill, I was going to say to you in that regard, when I taught this class at a college in New Jersey, my students, these were college students, college age students, they were very, very interested in Stephen Hawking's. They followed him, they monitored him, they knew a great deal about him. He was a source of some inspiration to them, which struck me. I didn't really know him that well, but he was kind of iconic in some ways. They admired this ability to learn and to relate and to explain with all of his limitations. So that's an interesting point.
Emil, remind us of the topic for next week.
We're going to do the issue of, I want to do two things next week. I'm going to blend them together. I'm going to talk about our resources and what we've come to in healthcare. What is healthcare? What are a country that provides a lot of healthcare. What are the pluses and minuses of healthcare? What about managed care? And I want to talk about transplants as a part of that, because transplants are a big aspect of our modern world. You know, we talk about genetic testing and all of that, but in this day and age, transplants are just as active a process. People get all kinds of transplants for a lot of things. So I wanted to talk about the ethics of how do we get spare parts? You know, I mean, really.
Now, will this be our last session?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
So I'll try to combine those two topics, and I hope by then I'll have a new Reuter. By then, I hope I'm going to be more stable at this point. Okay. Thank you all, folks.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Emil.
Emil.
Good night.
Have a good week.
Enlightening, as always.